Hi, I'm Pete Shaw. I'm the pastor here at Crosswalk, and I welcome you to this viewing of last week's teaching that was offered here at the church. Thanks for tuning in. You know, when I prepare teachings, if I'm the one that's teaching this week, which I usually am, I prayerfully and seriously ask God, what am I supposed to be getting across here this week? As I look through the scriptures, as I do my research, as I try to think about our people and our time in history and what we're dealing with in the world, that's my agenda. You know what's cool though, not only am I surprised sometimes in the ways that I sense God taking me in that preparation experience, but in the after effect of each sermon on both services, I'll get people every week that will come and tell me one or two things that just really nailed them. And they just knew this teaching was for them. And most of the time, I have no idea. I had no idea that was going to affect them in any way, because God's at work in the process. So as you watch the teaching today, I hope that God does that for you too. And here's my slant. I think God wants to do that for you. I think God is active and alive in our world and wants to speak to us and instruct us to help us experience the greatest life possible, not just for ourselves, but so that we can do something in this world to make it a better place. And so I think then the burden is a little bit on us to open up our eyes and our ears to see where God might stretch us. So I hope that happens for you today. And also, if you've been a beneficiary of Crosswalk's ministry, either through watching this teaching or any of our ministries that we do for the community with offering food to people or many other ways that we help locally or in Northern California or around the world through our mission stuff that we do, and if you believe in who we are and our message, I ask you to support us financially. It doesn't take much to make a big difference, but it takes a lot to make this thing happen around here. But if everybody chips in, we can really make some things happen. You need to know, I personally contribute thousands of dollars every year and have since I got here because I believe in this place and I believe in where we're headed. So if you want to continue to help Crosswalk pursue her mission, I invite you to help us out with that. As I say sometimes in church, if you love Crosswalk, love us in your donations. All right, have a great teaching. If I can ever answer any questions, feel free to email me, text me, stop by my office, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Look forward to serving you in any way I can. Thanks a lot. Hey Crosswalk, it's me, Pete. Sorry I'm not here with you this weekend. Had a special engagement come up my way. There's a gal that I did ministry with years ago in Princeton, Illinois. Her name is Rhonda Baker, and she started off as my administrative assistant and clearly had gifts that were going to move beyond that kind of role. And so I encouraged her as I was finishing out my time there in Illinois. I encouraged her to go on to seminary and see what God might have for her. And she overcame some pretty interesting obstacles to do that, largely within herself. Just what did it mean to be a woman going into ministry and this kind of stuff. And anyway, she graduated, did really well in seminary, was on staff at a church in the Las Vegas area. And then after a few years, she and another gal, a friend, decided to start their own ministry down there. So this Sunday marks their second anniversary, and they asked me to come speak and to help them celebrate. So it's a great honor for me to go back and see somebody that I had a part in their life and their ministry to go be a part of this big deal. So anyway, that's where I'm at, and actually I'm teaching on the very same thing that I'm teaching with you this week. So let me jump into that. A few weeks ago, I have our whole teaching schedule mapped out for about the next year. I know you could ask me about any date and I can tell you that's the text I'm going to be looking at. And when I first looked at this text, and we looked at it actually for the first time a couple weeks ago, I looked at it and thought, this is just one of those weird things that Jesus did. We'll be done with it in a week and then we'll be moving on. But I could not get over this text, and I'm still not over this text. This little text of these two, one weird story and then Jesus making a strange comment, they just got in my head. And I just started studying it a little bit harder and wondering what's really going on here and what I think's going on. And I'll read you the text in a minute. But I think just a few verses, I think they set us up for what Jesus was about to do during his last week of life and his last week of ministry. And they're pretty cool things that happen, pretty amazing things. And today's amazing thing we're going to see is right there in front of us in the text, and there's more than meets the eye, which I'm excited to tell you about. So let me read the text to you, and then we'll see what we see. So this comes out of Matthew 21, and I'm just going to read it straight out to you, starting in the 18th verse. This is the day after Palm Sunday, remember, and that's the context. So in the morning, when he returned to the city, he was hungry. This is Jesus. And seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing at all on it but leaves. Then he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. That's weird. When the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" And Jesus answered them, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive." So first, just to recap very briefly, this whole fig tree business. Remember that the fig tree was a metaphor that shows up in the Old Testament, and a fruitless fig tree shown up in some of the prophetic writings was an indicator to the people of Israel that they'd missed the mark. It wasn't good enough to be some kind of leafy tree that was going to give shade to people. No, the tree was meant to produce fruit. And when Israel would follow God and would be close to God, they would produce much fruit for themselves and ideally for the whole world. That was the idea. But when they got caught up in other things, when they got their focus on measuring on the wrong standard and just thought they were a wonderful leafy tree, that's when it didn't go well and they were held accountable. So the fact that Jesus does this thing to a fig tree just before he's about to go into the city again, where he knows he's going to meet resistance, that's no accident. And remember, Matthew compiled these stories, or at least Matthew's disciples compiled these stories much after the fact of Jesus' life, like 30-some years. And so for the reader, we're getting an allusion here to what is about to come. And we hear about a fig tree, bells should go off in our head if we're an ancient Jew, and we should be thinking, uh-oh, here we got some accountability stuff. There's a fig tree there with big green leaves, but no fruit. Ding, 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 something's about to come. And that's exactly what did happen. And you can read it yourself. I covered that in last week's sermon if you want to hear the full deal, where Jesus just went into the priests, which was the target here, not all Jews everywhere, but the priests of the temple who were running the show. He held them accountable with the gloves off and just went after them. So some pretty harsh stuff that he said, and all of it had to do with the fact that, hey, they thought they were really nailing it, being this big leafy tree, but they really weren't producing the fruit that they were supposed to. And if that weren't enough, the disciples have this normal reaction to like, hey, that's weird. We haven't seen you do that before. They've seen other cool things, but this is a new one. A tree going from, big leaf stuff to absolutely withering and dying, that was a new one. And so they reacted to it. And that's where Jesus said something kind of weird, which at first glance kind of is exciting, because Jesus is saying, hey, if you have faith and don't doubt, you can tell that this mountain to go into the heart of the sea, and it's going to happen. And I don't know about you, but at that moment, my wildest dreams kind of take over. And I'm thinking to myself, I like my cars, but I would love a Tesla. And hey, God, I will say pretty please. I will pray this prayer every day, and I will believe that you are big enough and you can sell the cattle on some of those thousands of hills that you own. And $80,000 cars, no big deal for you. You're God. So I'll even add in Jesus' name to the end of the prayer if that's what it's going to take to get me that Tesla. And I promise not to doubt. For those of you who don't know what a Tesla is, it is probably the coolest car on the planet if you're into electric cars. So anyway, still very cool. But I don't really think that's what it's about. And I think it's very easy for us to see this little chunk of this passage and think that the point is to just think big, pray big, because God is big and God can deliver big things to faithful people. Well, that's a good lesson. But I think there's something actually much deeper here that we need to pay attention to, that's rooted in history. One of the commentators that I read in preparation for that text, and I've been thinking about it ever since, he found something in Zechariah, which is a minor prophet toward the end of what we call the Old Testament. And in that passage, toward the end of his book, in fact, Zechariah 14, verses 4 and 5, you get this picture of God speaking to the people. And he's saying on that day, and the context is that Jerusalem is going to come under siege, and it's not going to go well. In fact, it's going to be horrific. And the bloodshed's going to be so bad. This is sort of like just before the full peace of God is going to come on, and God's going to finally kind of bring justice and bring calm back to the world and bring all nations to himself. Before that all happens, all hell's going to break loose, is kind of the picture that we have. And the enemies of the people of Israel are going to come in. They're going to wipe out Jerusalem. And the people within the walls of Jerusalem are going to be running for their lives because they're being chased by these oppressors, their enemies. And they're going to come out the gate, one of the gates of Jerusalem, and they're going to have a problem immediately. They're not going to get very far, because right outside one of those gates of Jerusalem, in fact, the one that Jesus is headed toward that day, they're faced with a mountain called the Mount of Olives. Now, it's more like a hill, but it's still formidable. And as they're coming out, they're going to realize that they can't run very fast anymore. There's going to be a bottleneck. And if you've got an army right behind you, and they're in better shape than you are, and they're carrying swords, there's a pretty good chance you're not going to make it. This is a scene of gore. It's a scene of terror. But the interesting thing that God says, and through this prophet, is he says, at that moment, I am going to separate. I'm going to stand on the Mount of Olives, and I'm going to push my legs apart, and I'm going to separate the Mount of Olives right down the middle. And so you're going to have half of the Mount of Olives on the north and half on the south, and there's going to be a flat valley right through the middle of it. The picture here that we see is that God is trying to make an escape route for those who are running for their lives. So even as this war is happening, even as this terrible thing is happening, God is interested in saving his people. And so what happens right when it's all happening? The picture you have is, in a sense, the Mount of Olives, or at least part of it, is being removed. It's being removed, separated, so that people can get through, so that those who are running for their lives will live. Now fast forward 400 years, and you have Jesus standing on the Mount of Olives. And he's just talked about the fig tree, and they're thinking, that's pretty cool. We're going to be able to say to this fig tree, we're going to be able to hold people accountable perhaps and remind them of their fruitfulness or their pursuit of being fruitful. That's sort of what the disciples are going to take home from that. But then he adds this extra thing. He said, you can say to this mountain, not just any old mountain, but he's saying to this mountain, be removed into the heart of the sea, and it'll happen. Have faith and do not doubt, and you will remove this mountain. What do you think he meant by that? Well, depending on when Matthew, the gospel, was published, this would not have been hard to figure out. Because maybe an early date for Matthew's publishing was somewhere around 65 AD. That's about the time when the Jews had a revolt against Rome, and they tried to take the city of Jerusalem back. A few years later, things did not go well, and Rome came down with an iron fist, and they just utterly destroyed the city and anybody who was in it. And so if it was a later date that Matthew came out, they'd be looking back and thinking, man, I know exactly what he means about getting rid of that mountain, because a whole lot of people got killed that day. And so we got to remember that their understanding of that image was pretty fresh in their mind, or at least it would be very soon, depending on when this thing hit people's hands. But I think we need to think metaphor here. I think we need to try to understand what is Jesus talking about moving mountains. And I think the way I'm getting this and the way I'm processing this is I'm seeing Jesus say to the disciples, you're going to come across people who are running for their lives. And you need to do whatever you got to do. You need to pray hard that they live, that they actually are saved from the peril that they're running from. Now, saved in theological words, we're not talking about just getting their soul saved so they can grab the heavenly elevator and go to heaven someday. That's a very minimalistic way of thinking about salvation. Salvation is big. It's whole life. It's all-encompassing. It's your wholeness. It's your well-being. It's everything working together as it should in perfect harmony. It's you being fully alive in the way that you were created to live. That's the essence of salvation. So what Jesus is saying is, you got people running for their lives. They know that there's something they're trying to escape, and they're hoping there's something to run toward. And in a theological way, it's like these people are desperate for God. They're desperate to live. You disciples, you pray that whatever is in the way of them reaching that safe place, of them reaching their salvation, you pray that that gets removed. That's the picture here. That's what we have here, is what obstacles are in the way of those who are running for their lives that we can pray against and see moved out of the way so that they can live and thrive. That's an interesting question. And there's a little bit of stuff for us to see here, even in the person of Jesus, about what that involves. So a question I had immediately is, well, what mountains should we be praying for? What mountains do we want to, if it's metaphor, what kind of mountains are we talking about? And actually a mountain showed itself to Jesus earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. It's a very interesting story. So Jesus and the boys, they take a weekend getaway, I guess, I don't know what, but they go up on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, north quite a ways, outside of the region that they all grew up in. And they're in this area, this region called the area between Tyre and Sidon. It looks like a coastal area. You can find it on the map, probably somewhere in Lebanon now, I think. And anyway, they're up there, and Jesus is known for his healing and his teaching and this kind of thing. And so he's doing his thing, and people are gathering around or whatever. And certainly there were some Jewish people up in that region that came to hear him and see what was going on. And then the Bible says that a Canaanite woman, which means a non-Jewish woman who is from that area, came up to him and pleaded with him, begged for him to do something for her. She said to him this, "My daughter is possessed by some kind of demon, and I'm begging you to heal her. I'm begging you to heal her." And she kind of went on and on. It was, one commentator I read, that she was kind of a pest about it. And so finally, Jesus looks at her, and can you imagine what Jesus would say at that moment, by the way? What's your guess? What do you think Jesus would say to a person who is that desperate, just wanting her child to live? Of course, you'd imagine Jesus, this guy who we love and who's so wonderful, is going to say back to this woman, "Oh, daughter, your faith has granted your request. Go in peace." But that's not what happened. A weird, crazy thing happens. Jesus kind of snaps at her. And Jesus says something along the lines of, "I'm here for Jewish people. Is it right? Is it right to feed the dogs?" Something that was meant for the Jewish people. In other words, he's calling her a dog. Not just her. I don't know what she looked like. Not just her, but all of the non-Jewish people. He's insulting her. He's basically saying, "Go away from me. I'm not here for you. I'm here for my people, not your people, not your kind." We see a little bit of racial nationalism going on here, racist nationalism at play right here before our eyes. But the woman doesn't give up. So she relents and she says, "Okay, I'm a dog, but don't even the dogs get some of the crumbs off the table of the children who are eating?" And at this moment, Jesus' demeanor changes. And he looks at her and says what we would hope he would say: "Your faith has saved you. Your daughter will be well." And at that very moment, the daughter, whatever was going on with her in this demon possession, was alleviated, and she was fine. what is this? What's going on here? Well, there's one commentator that suggests that Jesus had his own mountain to remove. You got to remember, Jesus was born at a time where Jewish people were not happy to be under Roman control. And so you've got a Jesus here who's born and raised in a very nationalistic society, saying Israel's number one and everybody else is just a big turd or something like that. I don't know if that's exactly the Hebrew, but something kind of like that. And anyway, everybody else is less than the Jews. And so that's what's been driven into his head his whole life. And now he's 30 years old or so, and he's doing his thing, and that's his worldview. And now he's faced with a situation where somebody needs his help, and he has to overcome this mountain of racist nationalism. And something shifts in him in the moment. A mountain is removed, because the mountain of racist nationalism, that's a mountain. And we see it get obliterated right there in the moment with Jesus. He had to deal with all kinds of internal stuff that was a part of his culture, a part of his identity, a part of his upbringing, everything. And in that moment, that mountain was removed. That's what I'm talking about. As you see Jesus facing a mountain that needed to be removed because he saw a woman who was running for her life and her daughter's life, and he made it easy. He got the mountain out of the way, and she was healed. Well, later on, same mountain had to be faced by the Apostle Peter. It's kind of ironic, really, because Peter would have witnessed this very thing and would have witnessed Jesus then reaching beyond the lines into other territories with all kinds of people after the fact. But Peter was still a man of his age, man of his country, still had the same kind of thinking that Jesus would have been raised with. And so there's this moment after Jesus' ministry's done, Peter's running the show. He's top dog. And he had to escape Jerusalem because it was getting a little too hot. And he's hanging out with a friend out on the coast. The boys love the coast. And so it's coming around lunchtime, and Peter's hanging out on the rooftop of this place, enjoying the sea view, getting some air. And it's lunchtime, his belly is grumbling, and his eyes catch this vision. And it's weird. This big sheet is lowered down from heaven, and in this sheet are all these non-kosher foods. Peter's Jewish, remember, and you're not supposed to eat non-kosher food. And so it's got all kinds of stuff that Peter's Bible told him explicitly, never eat that. And as he's seeing all this stuff come down, this voice from heaven says, take and eat. This vision happens 3 times in a row, and 3 times in a row, Peter refutes it and says, I'm not supposed to eat that, God. Don't even try to tempt me with this nonsense. I'm hungry, but I'm not that hungry. I know better. And the final time, the 3rd time, the voice says, don't call unclean what I have said is clean. And then he gets this prompt, this other voice in his head that says, be on the lookout. Somebody's going to be coming knocking at the door, and just go with it. Sure enough, there's a knock at the door. Some servants saying, we work for a guy named Cornelius who's a big deal military guy for the Roman government, and he wants us to grab Peter and take him with us to his house. So Peter, having just had this whole vision, still kind of in a cloud, he did eat. They stayed the night, then they went the next day. Maybe I thought it was, maybe a food thing, but it wasn't. So anyway, the next day, he grabs a couple guys, so he's not alone, and they go, and he finds himself in Cornelius's living room, of probably a pretty nice house of this Roman military official. And Cornelius has his family there and his other servants and friends who are all packed into this living room. Peter has no idea what's going on. And finally, Cornelius says to him, we know that you're one of these Jesus followers, and I've gotten a prompt to send for you from God's Spirit, and we want to hear about Jesus. What's going on here? And so Peter can't believe what's happening. And the first thing out of his mouth to start off this sermon of all sermons is he says, I really shouldn't be here with you people. You're a bunch of dogs, and I'm a Jew. So take that. But then he kept on going. They didn't kick him out. They didn't kill him. And so he probably preached one of the worst sermons ever because he's like, I don't want to waste my time with these people. And as he's preaching, the Spirit of God dumps on the people. And some of them start speaking in tongues and stuff, so it's very clear God has shown up in the building. And he looks at the disciples and he says, holy cow, can you believe this is going on? And he extends an invitation. He has this major mental thing that he goes through very, very quickly. And he thinks to himself and then finally says out loud, any of you guys want to be baptized? Because I can't see holding water baptism away from you guys if you've already been baptized by the very Spirit of God. And so the whole household got baptized. Now, that's a major mountain that had to be removed. Just like it was for Jesus, we see the same thing happen for Peter. That is a racist nationalism mountain that just got thrown into the sea. And why? Because there was a guy who was running for his life, and a whole family and set of friends in that living room that were running for their lives. They knew there was something that they were trying to get away from, and they were hoping there was something to go to. And what did Peter do in that moment? He got rid of the mountain. He in a sense, threw it into the heart of the sea. He made it easy for this people group to find God, to find the salvation that God had for them. Broke all kinds of rules in his head, went against all kinds of tradition, which was really tough for him to do it. And you know what happened after that, by the way? Just like Jesus had this happen repeatedly in his ministry, as soon as Peter did that, word got back to Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem Council, who kind of oversaw things, or the elders of the new church movement, and they were ticked off. They couldn't believe that Peter would have baptized Gentile believers. And Peter had to go make an account, and he told the story, kind of got off the hook, but it was a hot one, man. And so that tells us something about these mountains. Well, that's not the end of the story. In fact, that wasn't the end of that mountain being removed, which kind of tells us something that maybe there's some process going on here with mountain removal. And so fast forward a few years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years into the future. Yeah, something like 15 years later, maybe 20 years later. And now we have all these churches that are popping up in the Mediterranean area, and most of them are Gentile people. There's some Jews in there too, but more and more Gentile people and some Jewish people mixed in, and there are problems. Paul would go in and he would start a church, and then people would come in behind them who were very well-meaning Jewish Christians, and they would tell these Gentile Christians, non-Jewish Christians, they would say, well, if you're really going to be a good Christian, now, you need to be a good Jew, too. And don't you know that there are all these laws? There are like 613 laws for us to follow. And if you're really going to be a good Jesus follower, you need to follow those rules, too. It caused a lot of confusion because this whole Jewish thing, that was brand new to these Gentiles. I don't know anything about 613 rules, and I didn't think that was what it was about at all. And so things got bad and messy, and there was some infighting within the church. And so finally, the issue came to that very same Jerusalem council that would have held Peter accountable for baptizing those Gentiles. And here is the issue. Should the new church, how many rules should they follow? And whoppers like circumcision, which was like the sign of Jewish men that they were part of the covenant of God, should Gentile guys have to go through that? Is that even necessary anymore? So the Jerusalem council met. Just remember here for a second. Remember what we're talking about, 613 laws. This didn't come up yesterday, but this goes back to the very beginning. I mean, this goes all the way back to Abraham we're talking. So we're talking, 1,500, 2,000 years of tradition and history and Jewish identity is all coming down to this meeting. And so the Jerusalem Council sits together, and we don't know how long it lasted, but you got all the bigwigs there, right? All the power players. You got people who followed Jesus. You got people who studied Jesus. You got all the great thinkers. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better group of people around the table. And they dialogued. And they listened to each other. And they thought about it. And no doubt they argued about it passionately. And they prayed about it. And at the end of their meeting, they decided to write a letter. And you know what they wrote to the early church? They said, "Dear church, we've prayed about this, thought about this, argued about this, dialogued about this, and this is what we want you to do. We know," I'm paraphrasing, "we know there are 613 laws. We want you to follow 2 of them." 2. And the 2 we want you to follow are these. We don't want you to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and we want you to stop having sex before you get married, because there are all kinds of crazy stuff's happening. And we've heard about it. You need to stop that. That's it. 613 laws. Circumcision out the window. All kinds of other stuff out the window. Kosher foods for the most part, except for the idol thing, out the window. Can you get that? Can you get how huge that is? That is a mountain being removed and thrown into the heart of the sea. Now an entire people group, it just got way easier for them to find the salvation God had for them in Christ, because that council had the guts to prayerfully remove the mountain. Heavy duty stuff. Interestingly, a little bit after this, I think, Paul writes back to the church in Corinth, who's still struggling with this meat thing. And he says to them, he removes a little bit more of the mountain. He says to them, you know what? When it comes to meat sacrificed to idols, if you're around people that freaks out, don't barbecue the meat sacrificed to idols. But if you're with people, other believers or non-believers, who don't really think that's a big deal, and he kind of whispers to them, and I think you're right about that, there's not really a big deal here, but some people can't handle it. So he's saying to them, if you're in the company of people who it's not offensive to, pig out, man, enjoy the barbecue, you're getting cheap meat, and have a good time. So even that one rule, one of the two, got thrown out the window, or at least treated with respect. Very interesting stuff. This is mountain-moving kinds of stuff. So, 3 examples, all related to the same thing, of throwing a mountain into the sea, removing a mountain, getting a mountain out of the way, an obstacle out of the way for people who are running for their lives in one way or another as an act of salvation. So it makes me wonder, what can we expect? What kind of mountain should we be after? And what can we expect as we pray to see those mountains removed? Well, right away, I'm sure you can think of some of the mountains that you'd like to have removed. And they touch on things that Jesus dealt with in his ministry, I'm sure of it. I'm sure there are people groups that you think, man, those people really need help. I'm sure you think of, like for me, I think about our kids in Faraha in Africa. These orphan kids, unless they get a leg up, that mountain of extreme poverty, that mountain of malnutrition and no food, that's something we can do something about. And it's a little bit messy. It's hard for us to part with our money at times. But man, we see those kids thrive and it's like, wow, that was way worth it. But what can we expect when we pursue mountain removal, when we pray for that? What should we expect? Well, I think there are a couple things we can expect. The first thing, and maybe the biggest thing, is I think that we can expect that we find out that we're a little bit tied to the mountain. That there's a little bit of that mountain in us, and we've got to get rid of that and own it and understand it and struggle with it and process through it if we have any hopes of actually seeing that mountain removed and thrown into the heart of the sea. It's hard to do. My friend Rhonda, who I'm going to be with this weekend, she had a mountain just like that. And throughout seminary, she was struggling with this thing. She's a very capable person, and she's like, man, should I even be here? Because she grew up in a tradition that said, women are wonderful, except for in leadership over a man. And so she's got all this stuff going on in her head that she's overcoming, and she got her Master's of Divinity degree and looking at different options, and she's still struggling even at that moment. Is it okay for me to be a pastor of a church? And so she was on staff at a megachurch in the Vegas area, and I think she kind of felt at peace about that for a while because it was kind of a safe zone for her to work it out. But then when she started to recognize it was time to move in a new direction, I know she struggled with this for a moment. That's a mountain to overcome. Now I'm looking at it from my vantage point, and I grew up in a household of very strong women, and very capable, gifted women who in whatever capacity they were asked to lead, they did it and they did it well. And so that part of me, not really a problem. But I do have to admit, I have to confess, I have to be aware of this fact, that I'm a guy. And I'm a guy that even though I live in a free society, I still am a guy who lives in a male-dominated society. And I would be a fool to say that there aren't any kinds of tapes or biases that are zipping around in my head that are straight against gender equality. Even though I profess it with my mouth, I believe it with my heart, I'm a man of my culture. I'm a man of my time. There's no way that hasn't rubbed off on me somehow. In other words, what it means to me on this issue, which is a fairly easy one for me to process through, is, I've kind of proven that here and preached about that. But I have to be aware that this is something that needs to be managed and kept in check. because I'm a guy living in a male-dominated culture. And so the first thing I think we got to realize is that we need to process this stuff out. That when we say pray for a mountain to be removed, some of that mountain that's going to be removed is within us, that we are part of the mountain problem. We got to be honest about it. And I got to tell you, if Jesus had to do some process work on this, and I think he did, we kind of wrongfully imagine as soon as Jesus came out of the womb, the only thing human about him was his body. And everything else was, just all God. I don't think so. I think that's crazy talk. And the more we think about it, if he didn't really struggle with his worldview and biases and all that, then he wasn't really human. So let him be human. And what I'm saying is, if that guy had to process it, I think there's a really good chance you're going to have to process it, and I'm going to have to process it. And if Peter, who walked around with the physical Jesus and saw all that stuff go down, if he had to process it, you and I are going to have to process it. And if the sharpest minds who witnessed all of this stuff explode and incredible things happen in the early church, if they had to process it, giving all that they'd seen and experienced, man, you and I got to process this stuff. So first and foremost, when we're thinking about praying to remove mountains so that people running for their lives can find the salvation God has for them in all of its fullness, we got to realize that we got to do our own internal work here, because it's going to be tough, and there's more of the mountain in us than we would want to admit out loud. But the second big thing that I think we have to expect when we think about uttering this mountain removing prayer is that it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a total mess. Do any of you remember, this is years ago, good grief, early 1980s, late 70s, I'm not sure, probably should have Googled that. But you remember when Mount St. Helens erupted? And like a quarter or a third of the mountain just exploded into the atmosphere. You guys remember when that happened? I was a kid in elementary school in Kansas when that puppy went off. You know how much of a mess that thing made? You got to Google that. I'm sure there's lots of documentary stuff on that. As a kid in Kansas, on the eastern edge of Kansas, we saw the ash in the sky. When you move a mountain, it's messy. A big mess. And like I already said, Jesus kept moving mountain after mountain. When he moved and talked to the woman in Samaria, that was a mountain being moved. When he invited Matthew, the tax collector, to follow him, another mountain being moved. When he healed the blind guy, that's another mountain being moved. When he healed and touched the guy with leprosy, another mountain being moved. I mean, it was mountain after mountain after mountain he was doing. And it seems like every time he was moving a mountain, there were 10 people in the crowd who were crying foul, saying, you shouldn't be doing that. Even stuff that you'd think would be so good and so cool, people were complaining about it. It was a messy experience. There was a lot of cleanup work to do. And I know that that's true. That was true for Peter. He had to face the music. It was an ugly thing. And that's just the reality. So I think when we start to think about praying to move mountains, to remove mountains, to help people who are running for their lives to find the salvation that they're after, and salvation is found in relationship with God, I think we have to expect that as good as removing that mountain sounds to us, and as obvious as it seems we should do that, it's still going to be a mess. That's been one of the shocking things around here as pastor. As I've grown in my faith and understood things and preached about things, some of which I didn't think were going to be controversial at all. Some things I knew would be controversial and there'd be a mess to clean up, and I know that, and I'm going to try to follow my heart and the Spirit and what I think God is wanting me to call. But some things that I've preached about, which I thought were just so obvious and such good news on theological stuff, which should have just been, hey, everybody should be really happy to hear this. Huge mess. Couldn't believe it. I mean, like 10 years ago, when I start to talk about the fullness of salvation out of my doctoral work, and I'm all excited to say, hey, it's not just an afterlife thing, it's bigger than that. It's right here and now, and go for it, and it's going to be awesome, and we're going to have a picnic together, and blah, just trying to make it this good thing. People left the church over that, over a mountain of opening up salvation to being a bigger thing, not just something to look forward to eventually, but right now. And it was a mess. Couldn't believe it. So we should expect it. Some of the messes that we're going to encounter because we've removed mountains, prayed against those things, and asked for those things to be moved, some of those things we can guarantee are going to be messy. We start dealing with very sensitive issues in our culture about immigration, about gender equality, about sexual identity, about homelessness. Did I already say immigration stuff? If I didn't, then I'll say it twice. Immigration's a big deal here. Even issues like healthcare, which are all these political nightmare kinds of issues. All of these things are nightmare issues. Mess, mess, mess. And yet we have people that are running for their lives. And we are being invited by Jesus on the Mount of Olives to say, we want to see that mountain removed. Because the salvation that God has is for everybody. And we're called to be a part of that salvation. So today, around your tables, you're not getting anything to eat today from me. We've had Fig Newtons the last couple of weeks. Last week I gave you a Snickers bar to offset the grumpiness. This week you get a Clorox to-go wipe. And I want you to take one of these out, or maybe it's a wet wipe if you're in the early service. I want you to take one of these out, and I just want you to feel it. And I want you to smell it. You can even taste it if you want. I'm not going to, but go ahead. And I just want you to put that in your hands. And I want you to feel that as a reminder that this mountain removing business that we're called to do, which is an incredible privilege and it's awesome, and we're going to see people who are running for their lives find salvation because we're doing that, it's going to be messy. And the first mess that we're going to clean up is in ourselves. We have dirty hands already before we've even picked up the first shovel of dirt. And there's stuff in our own lives that are going to need to be scrubbed down pretty good. And then when we actually see that mountain removed, there's going to be a whole lot of dust in the air. And there's going to be a lot of cleanup to deal with people that don't want that mountain moved, and to help clean up the people who just found freedom and safety because we got the mountain removed in the first place. They're going to need some help with the mess, and we're just the ones to do it. So take this home with you. Let it dry out, sit on your countertop, hang it on your refrigerator, do whatever. Just don't throw it away quite yet. Remember what this represents. Maybe let it dry out and make it a bookmark for your Bible. I don't know. Make it a prayer cloth, perhaps, so that every time you see this, you remember that we are called to pray to remove mountains so that people running for their lives can find life and safety, because that's what God's about. I don't know what mountains you're going to pray for, but I hope you pray for them. And I hope that as you do, you're up for the hard work that's ahead. So may you do that. May you pray big for the mountains that God wants to remove. May you have eyes wide open to recognize the people around us who are running for their lives. May you have a heart that is open and broken to give a rip about the people who are desperate for life. And may you do the hard work internally and externally. May you endure the messes to clean up. May you keep your eyes focused on the joy of the ones who find life because you chose to pray that way. God bless you. I will see you next week. Hope you have a great week praying with your prayer cloth. See you then.